Good evening, everyone. Today we are going to organize a T20 series between two teams. One team is Team Unbeatable and other team is Team Royal Challenger. The owner of the Team Unbeatable is Mr. Sudhanshu Chakravarti and the owner of Team Royal Challengers is Mr. Aisman Panda. Today is the Mega Sunday. Total 29 players register for this mega action. Let's see who gets their slots between the two teams. Before we start the mega action, I want to say something to the owners that they have only 2,50,000 points to buy total of 11 players. Finally, it's the time for mega action. It's time to pick first player of this bet. First player, bowler, Sandy. First player, Sandy. Bowler, best price of 3,000. First call from Team Unbeatable for Sandy. 2,000. 3,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 4,000 calls from Team Unbeatable for player Sandy. 4,000 calls from right arm medium fast bowling. 4,000 calls from Team Unbeatable. 4,000 calls from Team Unbeatable. 5,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 6,000 calls from Team Unbeatable. 6,000 calls from Unbeatable. 7,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 8,000 calls from Unbeatable. 9,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 9,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 10,000 calls from Unbeatable for player Sandy. 10,000 calls from Unbeatable. 11,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 11,000 calls from Royal Challengers for player Sandy. 12,000 calls from Team Unbeatable. 12,000 calls from Team Unbeatable for player Sandy. 13,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 14,000 calls from Team Unbeatable. 14,000. 14,000 calls from Team Unbeatable for player Sandy. 15,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 15,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 16,000 calls from Unbeatable. 16,000. 16,002. Final call for Sandy. 16,003. Sold to Unbeatable. First player Sandy, who sold to Team Unbeatable the price of 16,000. It's time to pick a new player. New player, Lippu. New player, batsman, Lippu. Right hand batsman fast. Best price of 2,000 first call from Royal Challengers. Best price of 2,000. 3,000 calls from Unbeatable. 4,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 4,000 calls from Royal Challengers for player Lippu. 4,001, 4,002, final call for Lippu. 4,003, sold. Lippu sold to Royal Challengers. The price of 2,000. It's time to pick for a new player. New player. Akash. All-rounder player. Base price 5,000. First call from Team Royal Challengers. 6,000 calls from Unbeatable. 7,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 8,000 calls from Unbeatable.
8,000 calls from Team Unbeatable for player Akash. 9,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 10,000 calls from Unbeatable. 11,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 11,000 calls from Royal Challengers for player Akash. 12,000 calls from Unbeatable. 13,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 14,000 calls from Unbeatable. 15,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 16,000 calls from Unbeatables. 17,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 18,000 calls from Unbeatables. 19,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 20,000 calls from Unbeatables. 21,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 21,000 calls from Royal Challengers for player Akash. 21,000. 21,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 21,001. 21,002. Final call for Akash. 21,003. Sold. Akash sold to Royal Challengers. The price of 21,000. It's time to pick for a new player. New player. All-rounder player. All-rounder player. Shubham. Best price of 5,000. First call from Unbeatable. 5,000 calls from Unbeatable. 6,000 from Royal Challengers. 7,000 from Unbeatables for all-rounder player Shubham. 7,000 from Unbeatables. 8,000 from Royal Challengers. 9,000 from Unbeatable. 10,000 from Royal Challengers. 11,000 from Unbeatable. 12,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 13,000 calls from Unbeatable. 14,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 15,000 calls from Unbeatable. 16,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 17,000 calls from Unbeatable. 18,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 19,000 calls from Unbeatable. 20,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 21,000 from Unbeatable. 22 from Royal Challengers. 23 from Unbeatable. 24 from Royal Challengers. 25 from Unbeatable. 26 from Royal Challengers. 27 from Unbeatable. 28 from Royal Challengers. 29 from Unbeatable. 30,000 calls from Subha from Royal Challengers. 31 from Unbeatable. 32,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 33,000 calls from Unbeatable. 34 from RC. 35 from Unbeatable. 35,000 calls from Unbeatable for player Shubham. 35,000. All-rounder player Shubham. 36,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 37,000 calls from Unbeatable. 37,000 calls from Unbeatable. 38 from Royal Challengers. 39 from Unbeatable. 40,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 40,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 41,000 from Unbeatable. 42 from Royal Challengers. 42 calls from Royal Challengers for all-rounder player Subham. 43 from Unbeatable. 44 from Royal Challengers. 45 from Unbeatable. 46 from Royal Challengers. 47,000 calls from Unbeatable. 47,000. 48 calls from Royal Challengers. 48,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 49,000 calls from Unbeatable. 49,000. 49 from Unbeatable. 50,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 50,000 from Royal Challengers for all-rounder player Subham. 50,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 51 calls from Unbeatable. 52 calls from Royal Challengers. 52,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 53 calls from Unbeatable. 53,000. 53,000 calls from Unbeatable for all-rounder player Subham. 53,000. 54,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 54,000 calls from Royal Challengers for all-rounder player Subham. 54,000. 55,000 calls from Unbeatable. 55,000 calls from Unbeatable for all-rounder player Subham. 55,000. 56,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 56,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 56,000. 57,000 from Unbeatable. 57,000 calls from Unbeatable for player Subham. 57,001. 58,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 58,000. 58,000 calls from Royal Challengers for all-rounder player Subham. 58,001. 58,002. Final call for Subham. 58,003. Sold to Royal Challengers. The price of 58,000. Highest bidding player of this mega auction. Congratulations Subham for the highest bidding. It's time to pick for a new player. New player. Again a all-rounder player. All-rounder player Bapina. All-rounder player Bapina. Best price of 5,000. First call from Royal Challengers. The price of 5,000. 5,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 6,000 from Unbeatable. 7,000 from Royal Challengers. 8,000 from Unbeatable. 9,000 from Royal Challengers. 10,000 from Unbeatable. From Royal Challengers. 11,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 11,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 12,000 calls from Unbeatable. 12,000 calls from Unbeatable. 13,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 14,000 calls from Unbeatable. 15,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 16,000 calls from Unbeatable. 16,000. 17,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 18,000 calls from Unbeatable. 19,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 20,000 calls from Unbeatable. 21,000 calls from Royal Challengers for all-rounder player Bapina. 22,000 calls from Unbeatable. 23,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 24,000 calls from Unbeatable. 24,000. 25,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 26,000 calls from Unbeatable. 27,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 28,000 calls from Unbeatable. 29,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 30,000 calls from Unbeatable. 31,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 31,000 calls from Royal Challengers for all-rounder player Rapina. 31,000. 31,000 calls from Royal Challengers for all-rounder player Bapina. 32,000 calls from Team Unbeatable. 32,000. 33 calls from Royal Challengers. 34,000 calls from Unbeatable. 35 calls from Royal Challengers. 35,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 36,000 from Unbeatable. 37 from Royal Challengers. 37,000 from Royal Challengers. 37,000 calls from Royal Challengers for all-rounder player Bapina. 37,000. 38,000 calls from Unbeatable. 39,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 40,000 calls from Unbeatable. 41,000 from Royal Challengers. 41,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 41,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 42 from Unbeatable. 43 from Royal Challengers. 44 from Unbeatable. 45 from Royal Challengers. 46 from Unbeatable. 47 from Royal Challengers. 47,000 calls from Royal Challengers for player Rapina. 47,000. 48,000 calls from Unbeatable. 49 from Royal Challengers. 49,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 49,000. 49,001. 49,002. Final call for Papina. 49,003. Sold. Sold to Royal Challengers. The price of 49,000. It's time to pick for a new player. 49,000. New player. Left hand batsman Amit. New player Amit. A price of best price of 2,000. New player or left-hand batsman Amit. First call from Royal Challengers. 3000 calls from Unbeatable. 4000 from Royal Challengers. 5000 calls from Unbeatable. 6000 from Royal Challengers. 7000 from Unbeatable. 8 from Royal Challengers. 9 from Unbeatable. 10,000 from Royal Challengers. Ten thousand from Royal Challengers. 11 from Unbeatable. 11,000 calls from Unbeatable. 12 from Royal Challengers. 13 from Unbeatable. 14,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 15,000 calls from Unbeatable. 15,000 calls from Unbeatable. 16,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 17,000 from Unbeatable. 18,000 from Royal Challengers. 19,000 from Unbeatable. 20,000 from Royal Challengers. 21 from Unbeatable. 21,001. 21,002. 22,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 23 calls from Unbeatable. 23 calls from Unbeatable. 24 calls from Royal Challengers. 25 calls from Unbeatable. 25,001. 25,002. So final call for Amit. 25,003. So sold to Team Unbeatable. It's time for a new player. New player. Bowler Samir. Price of 3,000. New player Samir, base price of 3,000. First call from Unbeatable 3,000. First call from Unbeatable, price of 3,000. 4,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 5 from Unbeatable. 6 from Royal Challengers. 7 from Unbeatable. 8 from Royal Challengers. 9 from Unbeatable. 10 from Royal Challengers. 11 from Unbeatable. 12 from Royal Challengers. 13 from Unbeatable. 14 from Royal Challengers. 15 from Unbeatable. 16 from Royal Challengers. 17 from Unbeatable. 18 from Royal Challengers. 19 from Unbeatable. 20 from Royal Challengers. 21 from Unbeatable. 22 from Royal Challengers. 23 from Unbeatable. 24 from Royal Challengers. 24. 25 from Unbeatable. 26 from Royal Challengers. 27 from unbeatable. 28 from Royal Challengers. 28,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 28,000 calls from Royal Challengers for bowler Samir. 29,000 from unbeatable. 30,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 31 from unbeatable. 32 from Royal Challengers. 33 from unbeatable. 34 from Royal Challengers. 34,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 35 calls from unbeatable. 36 calls from Royal Challengers. 37,000 from unbeatable. 38 calls from Royal Challengers. 38,000. 38,000 from Royal Challengers. 39,000 calls from unbeatable. 40,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 40,000 from Royal Challengers. 41 from unbeatable. 42 from Royal Challengers. 43 from unbeatable. 44 from Royal Challengers. 44,000. 45 from unbeatable. 45 from unbeatable. 45,001. 45,002. 46 from Royal Challengers. 47 from unbeatable. 48 from Royal Challengers. 48,000 from Royal Challengers. 49 from unbeatable. 49,001. 49,002. Final call for Samir. 49,003. Sold. It's time for a new player. New player. Bowler Saurabh. Best price of 3,000. Best price of 3,000. First calls from team unbeatable. For player Saurabh. First calls from team unbeatable. The price of 3,000. 4,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 5,000 calls from unbeatable. 5,000 calls from unbeatable. 5,001. 5,002. Final call for Saurabh. 5,003. So it's time for a new player. Again a bowler. Pretos. Base price of 3,000. New player Priotos, base price of 3000. Any bid for Priotos? 3000 calls from Royal Challengers, 4000 from Unbeatable, 5 from Royal Challengers, 6 from Unbeatable, 7 from Royal Challengers, 8 from Unbeatable, 9 from Royal Challengers, 10 from Unbeatable, 11 from Royal Challengers, 12 from Unbeatable, 13 from Royal Challengers, 14 from Unbeatable, 14,000 from Unbeatable, 15 from Royal Challengers, 16 from Unbeatable, 4ଟା ପ୍ଲେୟାର କିଣିଛନ୍ତି, 4ଟା ପ୍ଲେୟାର ତାଙ୍କେ କିଣିଛନ୍ତି, ତୁ 4ଟା ପ୍ଲେୟାର କିଣିଛୁ, ତୋର ପର୍ସ 1,18,000, ତମର 1,55,000, 16,000 calls from Unbeatable, 17 from Royal Challengers, 18 from Unbeatable, 19 from Royal Challengers, 19,000 from Royal Challengers, 19,000 Royal Challengers, 20 from Unbeatable, 21 from Royal Challengers, 21,000 calls from Royal Challengers, 21,001, 21,002, final call for Priotos, 22 calls from Unbeatable, 22 calls from Unbeatable, 23 from Royal Challengers, 24 from Unbeatable, 24 from Unbeatable, 24,000 calls from Unbeatable, 24,000, 25 from Royal Challengers, 25,001, 25,002, final call for Priotos, 25,003, sold. 25,000. It's time for a new player. Again a new player, bowler Sanu. Bid price of 3,000. First calls from Unbeatable, 3,000. 4,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 5 from Unbeatable. 5 from Unbeatable. 5,000 calls from Unbeatable. 6 from Royal Challengers. 6,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 7 from Unbeatable. 7,000 calls from Unbeatable. 7,001. 7,002. Final call for Channu. 7,003. Sold. It's time for a new player. Unbeatable. Okay. All-rounder player. Aditya. Base price of 5,000. First call from Unbeatable. 5,000. 5,000 calls from Unbeatable. 6,000 from Royal Challengers. 7 from Unbeatable. 7 from Unbeatable. 8 from Royal Challengers. 9 from Unbeatable. 9,000 calls from Unbeatable. 9,000 from Unbeatable. 10,000 from Royal Challengers. 11 from Unbeatable. 12 from Royal Challengers. 13 from Unbeatable. 14 from Royal Challengers. 15 from Unbeatable. 16 from Royal Challengers. 17 from Unbeatable. 17 from Unbeatable. 18 from Royal Challengers. 19 from Unbeatable. 20,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 21 from Unbeatable. 22 from Royal Challengers. 23 from Unbeatable. 24 from Royal Challengers. 25 from Unbeatable. 26 from Royal Challengers. 27 from Unbeatable. 28 from Royal Challengers. 29 from Unbeatable. 30 from Royal Challengers. 31 from Unbeatable. 32 from Royal Challengers. 33 from Unbeatable. 33,000 calls from Unbeatable for all-rounder player Aditya. 33,000. 34 from Royal Challengers. 35 from Unbeatable. 36 from Royal Challengers. 37 from Unbeatable. 37,000 from Unbeatable. 38 from Royal Challengers. 39 from Unbeatable. 39 from Unbeatable. 40,000 from Royal Challengers. 41 from Unbeatable. 42 from Royal Challengers. 43 from Unbeatable. 44 from Royal Challengers. 45 from Unbeatable. 46 from Royal Challengers. 47 from Unbeatable. 48 from Royal Challengers. 48 from Royal Challengers, 49 from Unbeatable, 50 from Royal Challengers, 50,000 calls from Royal Challengers, 51 from Unbeatable, 51,000 calls from Unbeatable, 51,000, 52 from Royal Challengers, 53 from Unbeatable, 54 from Royal Challengers, 55 from Unbeatable, 56 from Royal Challengers, 57 from Unbeatable, 57 from Unbeatable, 58 from Royal Challengers, 59 from Unbeatable, 60,000 calls from Royal Challengers, 61 from Unbeatable, 61 from Unbeatable, 62 from Royal Challengers, 62 2001, 62,002, final call for Royal Challengers, 62,003 sold to Royal Challengers. The price of 62,000. It's time for a new player. Again a all-rounder player. Chinnu. You can call max to max 25,000. You can't go over 25,000. But you need to buy more than 5 players. Max to max 2,000 ଲେଖେ ତମେ ସିଏ 6ଟା ପ୍ଲେୟର କିଣିଛି ଆଉ 6ଟା ପ୍ଲେୟର କିଣିବ 12,000 କାଟିଲେ Due to some personal issue, team owner shifted from Ayushman Panda to Mr. Subham Pradhan, and he is the owner of team Royal Challengers. ଆଉ ଥରେ କୁହା ହବ କି ମୁଁ ତ ମନରୁ କହୁଛି new player Chinnu, the price of 5,000. First calls from Royal Challengers, the price of 5,000. 6 from Unbeatable, 7 from Royal Challengers, 8 from Unbeatable, 9 from Royal Challengers, 10 from Unbeatable, 11 from Royal Challengers, 12 from Unbeatable, 13 from Royal Challengers, 14 from Unbeatable, 15 from Royal Challengers, 16 from Unbeatable, 17 from Royal Challengers, 18 from Unbeatable, 19 from Royal Challengers, 20 from Unbeatable, 20,001, 20,002, 31,000 ଅଛି କିନ୍ତୁ ଆମେ କିଣିବ 6ଟା ପ୍ଲେୟର 12,000 କାଟିବ ରହିଲା 19,000 19,000 ତମ ସରିଲା 20,000 calls from Unbeatable, 20,001, ତମେ 6ଟା ପ୍ଲେୟର କିଣିଛ 5ଟା ପ୍ଲେୟର କିଣା ହବନି ନା from Unbeatable, 22,001, 22,002, 22,003 sold to team Unbeatable. It's time for a new player, a all-rounder player, Chandan. Price of 5,000. First call from Unbeatable, 5,000. 6 from Royal Challengers, 7 from Unbeatable, 8 from Royal Challengers, 9 from Unbeatable, 10 from Royal Challengers, 11 from Unbeatable, 12 from Royal Challengers, 13 from Unbeatable, 14 from Royal Challengers, 15 from Unbeatable, 16 from Royal Challengers, 17 from Unbeatable, 18 from Royal Challengers, 19 from Unbeatable, 20 from Royal Challengers, 21 from Unbeatable, 21,001, 21,002, 21,003 sold to team Unbeatable. It's time for a new player. Again a all-rounder player, Soumya Ranjan Behra. Base price of 5,000. First from team Unbeatable, 6 from Royal Challengers, 7 from Unbeatable, 8 from Royal Challengers, 9 from Unbeatable, 10 from Royal Challengers, 11 from Unbeatable, 12 from Royal Challengers, 13 from Unbeatable, 14 from Royal Challengers, 14 from Royal Challengers, 15 from Unbeatable, 16 from Royal Challengers, 17 from unbeatable, 18 from Royal Challengers, and 19 from unbeatable, 20 from Royal Challengers, and 21,000 calls from unbeatable, 21,001, 21,002, 21,003 sold to unbeatable. It's time for a new player. New player, Ram. The price of 2,000. Base price of 2,000. Any call for Ram? 3. छोड़ा. Any call for Ram? Unsold. New player, Ishwar. Price of 2,000. Any call for Ishwar? Hmm. 2,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 2001, 2002, 2003 sold. Sold to Royal Challengers. The price of 2,000. New player, all-rounder player, all-rounder player Vibhuti. Team unbeatable. The price of 5,000. 6 from Royal Challengers. 7 from unbeatable. 8 from Royal Challengers. 9 from unbeatable. 10 from Royal Challengers. 11 from unbeatable. 12 from Royal Challengers. 13 from unbeatable. 14,000 from Royal Challengers. 15 from unbeatable. 16 from Royal Challengers. 17 from unbeatable. 18,000 from Royal Challengers. 19,000 from unbeatable. 20,000 calls from Royal Challengers and 21,000 calls from team unbeatable. 21,001, 21, 21,002, 21,003 sold to unbeatable. The price of 21,000. Time for a new player. New player. New player Rahul. The price of 2,000. 63,000. First calls from Royal Challengers. 3,000 from unbeatable. Unbeatable. 3,000 from unbeatable. 4 from Royal Challengers. 5 from unbeatable. 6 from Royal Challengers. 7 from unbeatable. 7 from unbeatable. For a star batsman, effortless fielder, Rahul Marana. 7,001, 7,002, 7,003 sold to unbeatable. The price of 7,000. New player, a batsman, Roson. Bid price 2,000. Best price 2,000 for batsman Roson. Any call for Roson? First call from Royal Challengers, the price of 2,000. 2001, 2002, 2003 sold. It's time for a new player. It's a bowler, star bowler, Umma. The price of 3,000. First from Royal Challengers. 3,000 calls from Royal Challengers. 3,001, 3,002, 3,003 sold. Sold to team Royal Challengers. New player, lefty batsman or lefty bowler, Niru. The price of 3,000. First calls from unbeatable. Niru. 3,000 from unbeatable. 4 from Royal Challengers. 5 from unbeatable. 5 from unbeatable. 56,000. You can go for 54,000. 6 from Royal Challengers. 7 from unbeatable. 8 from Royal Challengers. 9 from unbeatable. 10 from Royal Challengers, 11 from Unbeatable, 12 from Royal Challengers, 13 from Unbeatable, 14 from Royal Challengers, 15 from Unbeatable, 16 from Royal Challengers, 17 from Unbeatable, 18 from Royal Challengers, 19 from Unbeatable, 20 from Royal Challengers, 21 from Unbeatable, 22 from Royal Challengers, 22 calls from Royal Challengers, 23 from Unbeatable. ନା ଗୋଟେ ଯିବ ନାଇଁ ନଅଟା ପିଲା କିଣିଛି ନା ଆଉ ଦିଟା କିଣିବ ସରିଲା 23,001 23,002 23,003 sold. ସରିଲା ଶେଖର sold ତ ଏଇଟା ହବ କି ସରିଲା ଏଇଟା ବନ୍ଦ କରିଦେ ଏଇଟା ବନ୍ଦ କରିଦେ ଓଭର ଏଇଟା ବନ୍ଦ କରିଦେ ତୁ moment of the mega auction. Tomorrow is the match. There is total 3 matches in this series. All players are sold to these two teams. One team is Team Unbeatable and other one is Royal Challengers. 12 players per team. There is a impact rule in this tournament. All players should play with proper behavior and manners in this tournament, and all captains and their owners should obey the rule and regulation of this CPL management teams, and all players should come to the ground tomorrow at 1 p.m. Thank you. Good night. See you tomorrow.